states. With that, I'm going to move on to the 2022 Load ICA Refinement Annual Report filed by SDG&E. Thanks, Harry. Starting with a description of issues and challenges, as I mentioned in February, Load ICA work plan and also SDG&E's 2022 annual report, we already provided kind of an overview of some of the issues and challenges associated with making the Load ICA refinements and the subsequent 5 modeling changes. So currently, as I laid out earlier, the Load ICA is based on the current distribution system topology model. Typically comes from each utility's GIS system. For SDG&E, our GIS system feeds into the Load ICA model. So that reflects the project that have been placed in services and does not really reflect the future system topology, which may be coming from the distribution system upgrades that are identified or just the permanent system configuration changes that needs to happen to the topology. And in addition to that, the base load profiles for ICA are built mostly based on the historical load data, either comes from our SCADA system or come from our advanced metering infrastructure system as an aggregate to inform kind of a base load condition for load ICA analysis. So for some of the new circuits coming out of those distribution system upgrades and or configuration changes, we don't necessarily have historical load data exist to build the new circuit profile. So we have to develop the methodology to come up with those profiles and in order to populate the base load case for ICA. Last but not least, for those of you who have used ICA, Load ICA currently is the data layer that's layered on top of the GIS shape files to kind of give whoever access ICA the flavor of how does that overlay with the actual, the street, the district, and kind of the system topology. In order to reflect the newer sort of a future system topology or configuration changes, we have to make changes to our process and workflow to reflect those new data layer coming in via those future distribution system upgrades. So it's kind of on a high level some of the challenges that we are working through and hoping to address with the solutions to implement the 5 modeling changes requested by the LJ ruling. Next, I'll provide an overview of what SDG&E is doing for each of the 5 modeling changes. Starting with the first one, where the model needs to be updated to have all the quick load projects and the planned known and near-term distribution system projects. So currently in the Load ICA model, we currently already model the known load projects within service date within the first year of the DPP planning horizon. That's kind of consistent with how we model the known load for GNA as well. So as far as the model, the planned distribution system upgrades, as I explained earlier, we will implement that part of the distribution system upgrade because we consider that's kind of a subset of the distribution system upgrades. So speaking of the distribution system upgrades modeling, which is the second modeling enhancement, we plan to include distribution system upgrades identified with a approved construction schedule specifying in-service dates that are within the first year of the DPP planning horizon. As I mentioned earlier, we are currently in the process of implementing such modeling changes to make sure that's accurately captured in the Load ICA base model. For the number 3 modeling enhancement request, include the impact of forecast DR growth in the loads modeled in Load ICA. Currently, for our Load ICA models, SDG&E already include the forecasting load for the first year of the DPP planning horizon. I know there's some question on that earlier about sort of what we use for the forecasting load and forecast DR growth. SDG&E is consistent with what Ryan was describing there for SCE. We also use the system level DR forecast provided by IPER and then disaggregate down to the circuit level. So that's also consistent with how we model the growth in our GNA. Next slide, please. For the modeling enhancement number 4, where the model Load ICA to consider plant network and reconfiguration, Just to clarify, we interpret this requirement as asking to include the planned permanent network reconfiguration identified with DPP within service they are within the first year of the DPP planning horizon. The reason I want to make that clarification is that I want to make sure that we are not going to include the temporary network configuration that are typically called by our distribution operation department, sometime in response to a system interruption or a faulted event, and those are not going to be included in the load ICA modeling change. And last but not least, the number 5, the modeling enhancement is asking to model the load ICA with load forecast for the next year. So we interpret this requirement as the need to include in the load ICA forecast load for the first year of the DPP planning horizon. Just like the modeling request number 3, this is kind of goes hand in hand with that. We currently already include the forecast load for the first year of the DPP horizon in our load ICA. And this is also something that we use in consistent using the IPER forecast disaggregated down to the circuit level. Moving on to the next slide. To recap on what I just described for the 5 modeling changes as part of the load ICA refinement, also kind of just trying to visually show what are the input data that currently goes into the load ICA. And what's already being implemented so far at SDG&E's load ICA includes the next year DER growth, the next year load forecast, and also the next year known load projects. And items are still under development, and we're looking to actually design and develop are the plant distribution system upgrades and also the plant network reconfiguration. Next slide, please. Providing also kind of a recap on the timeline for implementing the solution that we proposed. This is consistent with what we filed last year in our 2022 annual report. So far, we're still targeting for Q3 of 2025 to finish the workflow design, IT process update, and also the map update to implement the remaining changes that I described in the last few slides, which is the distribution system upgrades and also the network configuration. Next slide, please. Shifting the topic slightly from the load ICA refinement and modeling changes over to the aggregated uniform load results that were also asked to be included in the annual report. We're populating this data inconsistent with what we provided as December 15, 2022, which is when SDG&E filed our 2022 annual report. As you can see here, we file our report using the most limiting methodology, where we do want to kind of clarify that the methodology is a relatively limiting way of interpreting the load ICA result as compared to the nodal hour methodology. As a definition for the most limiting hour methodology, which is what was in the second column here in this table, this methodology represents the count and percentage of nodes with at least 1 out of the 576 hours simulated for that node. Uniform load ICA results equal to 0 and accounts for only the most limiting hour. Basically, what's saying that as long as you have 1 hour out of the 576 hour is showing 0 capacity, is considered as marking the entire circuit or / line segment as the 0 load capacity. So as you can imagine, being the most limiting hour, this methodology really creates a false perception of a low capacity for additional load, because depending on what kind of load you're looking to interconnect, it's not really going to always come in at that load level at every nodal hour. And in contrast to that, what we also propose and show as a reference here for folks to consider is the percentage we show here using the nodal hour methodology. The definition of nodal hour methodology is that it considers the total number of nodal hours, where it equals total number of nodes multiplied by 576, instead of just the most limiting hour. So this methodology addresses the shortcoming of the most limiting hour and really covers kind of all the uniform load ICA results for each node for all the hours. As you can see in here, for SDG&E's data, the 0 kW or the percentage falling in that category is a much smaller number compared to using the most limiting methodology. Next slide, please. I'd also like to recap the efforts we have been doing in order to increase the confidence in the load ICA results that are currently published on our data portal. So between 2021 and to date, we have been updating our modeling and analysis tool and also made some data corrections in order to fix some of the data errors in our model. The correction that we made to date have already resulted in fewer line segments and the substation transformer showing 0 hosting capacity. We're still today continuing this effort, and we expect further reduction in the number of line segments showing 0 hosting capacity. Next slide, please. Coming on to the last component of the annual report, we're covering the summary of IOU coordination with the CEC on ICA tool updates. As listed in our annual report we filed in 2022, as of 2022, we haven't really had any formal discussion addressing ICA data in the year of 2022, although we did participate in previous discussions with CEC regarding the Edge tool as they were trying to interconnect the ICA data into the Edge tool as the input. And slightly update compared to what we filed in the annual report in February 2023 at CG&E, and also along with the other IOUs, we did meet with CEC, where CEC graciously provided us a status update of the CEC's Edge tool development, some of the consideration they have for the data inputs. So that's something we just want to kind of include here as an additional item regarding our effort with CEC on the load ICA tool updates. I believe this actually marks my last slide. I'm going to turn it back to Ari.
Sure. So we have plenty of time for questions for E. It says 5 minutes here, but we can actually take more like 10 minutes of questions and still stay on track. So I'm going to hand it over to Taru and Tyler to sort through the questions. And just as a reminder, if we can keep these questions focused on what the SDG&E presentation was about, we can address other questions later on.
So Ari, we still have unanswered questions. Would the presenters, all the IOUs, be able to handle those as well?
I'm thinking, Taru, that we have a question and answer period after each presenter. Maybe it would make sense for those big questions that we got earlier in the presentation, if we could hold those. I'd ask you or Tyler to kind of keep track of them, and then we could get all of the presenters on after they've spoken. Again, some of these things may be clarified once PG&E and SE get to speak, and then they could come together. All three of them could try to handle those questions as a team, to get different perspectives on them. What do you think about that, Taru?
So that sounds fine. So for now, in these 5 minutes, I guess the questions we can take are the questions specific to SDG&E's presentation.
Yeah, I think that would make sense. And then we'll get all three presenters back on it at the end. Yeah.
Okay.
I have in the chat, there is Sky Stanfield is saying that they have a series of questions about node hour methodology, and if we can unmute them to ask.
Sky, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thanks for the presentation. I have I have a few sort of series of questions about the shift to the node hour methodology. I should say that I'm representing IREC. So the first question is the node hour methodology that you're proposing to shift to how you evaluate if new loads can be interconnected today under your traditional interconnection study process for new loads?
Yeah, so for the new load process, right now, when we get a project, we will typically evaluate performing a series of capacity studies, which will include evaluating how the load will attribute to the system peak, how does it impact, the grid's behavior, and identify any grid needs. It's it's similar to the nodal hour methodology, but what we're proposing here is not a methodology of how the studies perform, is how the data is interpreted. Like as I was mentioning earlier, Sky, like it really depends on what the load project is and what equipment is included in the project, right? If it's a EV project or if it's a battery, it's going to have a different kind of an impact on load. And in the load profile, which we typically use as we consider how this load project is going to impact the peak, is going to take that into consideration of the type of load and the type of equipment this particular load project is going to use. And it's not always going to impact it in a nodal level, but it's not going to impact it at the most limiting methodology level.
Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by the differences? Do you simply mean the hours of the day or the profile of the project? What do you mean by, so that we're trying to get the ICA results to be useful and meaningful for the customers to evaluate interconnection? I think it would be helpful to explain a little bit more what those differences are and why or how they're not reflected in the ICA, so that we can figure out if this shift is going to provide them an accurate assessment of what the interconnection process would result in.
Yeah, sure. I think one clarification I would like to make and one important distinction to draw between load ICA and the detailed engineering review is, as what I was describing, that load ICA does not encompass everything that a planner or engineer considers when they're performing engineering review, right? So as Ryan presented earlier, the interconnection process starts when we receive a complete application, including all the details on what equipment is going to be included in the load application, what type of load it is, and all of that is taken into consideration when an engineer is performing engineering review. And sometimes we'll even have to do like fusing studies, protection coordination studies. It just depends on what equipment is coming through along with the application. And I understand your concern about low ICA doesn't really reflect that, but that's actually just a distinction with how load application is designed, right? It's not able to capture and by no means can replace engineering detailed review that's performed by engineer/planner when they're reviewing the project.
I think that warrants a whole lot more conversation, especially in light of the origination of the ICA and the use cases. But I am intimately familiar, as you know, that the ICA doesn't cover every aspect of what's reviewed in interconnection, but it does give you specific results on voltage and thermal, for example. And I would like to make sure that those results are aligning with what your methodologies are when you do the interconnection study itself. But let me ask a few more questions. So I don't think you answered directly whether you're using the node hour methodology or whether that aligns closer with the methodology you're using in the study versus the traditional most limiting methodology. But my next question would be, why would it make sense to use the node hour methodology for load if that's not what's used for generation? What's the different operating philosophy behind changing from using a different method for load versus generation? Is it because of the way in which you treat costs, or because of an actual electrical engineering difference?
So I think one thing we want to kind of clarify is that the nodal hour methodology and the most limiting methodology here is not a methodology we use to calculate load ICA, right? When you look at the ICA analysis, I know you're very familiar with it. The analysis itself is already a nodal hour methodology, right? It calculates the 576 for every single node and make those data available. And the sort of the two distinction we're showing on the screen is simply how people or how we are presenting the data, if you will. it's not the actual load ICA methodology. So that's kind of why I was unable to answer your question when you asked me, is this the methodology we use for planning, right? Because this is just a methodology of how to demonstrate the data, because that's what we're showing
Right.
here.
So
Right.
what I'm trying to understand from this is what is changing this going to tell the customer? And that's, I'm going to ask this 3 times. If you change this over, what does the new result tell me in terms of whether or not it's useful to assess whether I can interconnect without upgrades, which is the purpose of the ICA?
Yeah. So, you know, one thing I think maybe Saeed actually covered it earlier when talking about sort of the ICA background information, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, this data, this table you're seeing is not something that we are providing to customer to help them decide the project, right? So this is a data, I think this actually comes out of the IRIC data request, if not, I'm not mistaken, right? We want to make sure folks are not using the most limiting methodology to think or to come to the conclusion that ICA data is not accurate, right? Because that's not really what the zeros is showing. A lot of 0 kW are actually due showing that there's 0 kW at some point at a nodal hour on the circuit does not indicate there's no capacity to interconnect a project. So for a load interconnection customer, what I'm trying to communicate for a CG&E's customer is that if you're interested in submitting a load application, yes, you can use load ICA. It provides you a direct understanding on the circuit and on the location they're trying to interconnect if there's going to be a capacity available for them to interconnect. But to get a full engineering review and a full interconnection process going through, we encourage customer to engage with SDG&E as soon as possible by submitting an application and providing us details on what type of load project they are looking to interconnect. And we can correlate that with a typical load curve and also perform engineering review to make sure the customer knows as soon as possible that if the project is going to be interconnected at a location with capacity. And a lot of time what plays into that discussion is also involves, you know, the time frame the customer is looking to interconnect, right? We have customer coming to SDG&E with a project that spans across 3 years, right? We look at capacity, you know, the GN data, like the 3 years load planning capacity. Sometimes we even deliver a customer like almost like a schedule, right? Here's the load that can be interconnected in year 1, year 2, and year 3. So that simply cannot happen just by looking at a table here showing 0 capacity, right? If that makes sense.
It doesn't, but I want to move on to other parts of this question. So as will be presented by PG&E in a moment, PG&E, when the utilities originally did their ICA and we pulled together the data that resulted in this table coming into fruition, all the utilities had a similar percentage around those segments that showed 0 capacity. PG&E, through a variety of different data validation efforts, has dramatically shifted that and got the number of their nodes down to about 25% that show 0 kilowatts of capacity. I want to understand why is it, if that's reflective of a difference in SDG&E and PG&E's system, or if that's a fundamental difference that needs to be explored. You're proposing to do something that, as far as I understand, PG&E has not done, that would dramatically change what kind of results a customer sees. But I don't know if I understand why PG&E's results change so dramatically and SDG&E hasn't done those same steps yet.
Fair enough. I can't really speak to PG&E's data, so I advise we kind of hold a question until PG&E's individual presentation. Does that make sense to you?
Not really. We've talked about this for a number of years now.
If I may break in, Sky, we do have a direct communication with you. You know that all 3 IUs have been communicating with you on load ICA. I think it would be fair to move to other questions we have from other advocates and other participants here. we understand your concerns, and you do have a direct line of communication with us. So there's other questions here, and I'd like E to have the chance to address those questions as well.
Sure. Can I just circle back here? The questions we've been having correspondence with you about are not related to the load ICA issues I'm asking about right now. SDG&E is proposing a change to the methodology, or not the methodology, I guess how they're going to show the data. So those were what I was focusing my questions on. But I wanted to let others have a chance to ask their questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Ben Schwartz from Clean Coalition asking, can you explain how SDG&E has been validating or improving their data? Is it on a circuit by circuit basis or prioritized by feeders with zero available capacity?
Yeah, so we actually has established a formal ICA data validation plan, also as part of the ICA refinements ruling that was ongoing in 2019, actually 2021. So what happens now is that our team actually has a metric that we measures the load ICA, and that triggers our engineers to perform a deep dive review of the circuit that, for example, generates a lot of zero capacity results or has a issue or complaining about missing a profile, missing a protection setting. So we can address those as ICA is updating and compiling. And in addition to that, we are doing system-wide refresh every year annually. So we have one coming up. In that refresh, we're looking to look at all the circuits and make sure we don't have any zeros that are misrepresented in our load ICA data. I hope that answered your question, but feel free to ask follow-ups.
So Ben, I've unmuted you if you want to ask a follow-up.
Yeah, just as a follow-up to that, in the instance where, a number changes and it potentially impacts a customer that is either, starting an application or has an application that's in the process, is that customer notified, or how does that work?
So do you mean the load ICA data change?
Yeah, for example, where there was a zero, there's no longer a zero, or potentially there was hosting capacity and now that's a zero.
Oh, so let me just clarify that. If a customer applies for load interconnection, right, in the engineering and planning and estimating steps that Ryan presented earlier, our engineer and our planner in our kind of a new service interconnection group collectively will perform a detailed engineering review, right? We'll model the circuit and take consideration of all the information, including the project. And that's the process that's independent from the load ICA, right? Load ICA was a data portal that was presented to give customer directional information, but our engineering review is detailed and takes into all consideration of the data and of the model. And we are confident that our process is not really gonna stop a project because there's a zero capacity load ICA, because each project is studied separately, individually.
We have another question from Sam White asking to clarify or confirm that node hour methodology looks at an hourly new load profile as opposed to a uniform load, flat or constant profile. This sounds like matching load and capacity profiles.
So again, I don't know if you can go back to the slide. The node hour methodology here is not changing the methodology within the ICA analysis. What we're doing here is when we're looking at the ICA results, we are looking at every single node and every single hour across the 576 and compiling how many of these results capacity is in the 0 kW and then bucket it into this percentage, right? So it's not really changing the uniform load results. Okay. I'm not really sure I understand what's a flat load results. If you want to come off mute and explain yourself, that may be helpful.
Yes, thank you. Sam White for 350 Bay Area. As you present this, it's unclear exactly what it's showing. It looks like if you're doing an hourly node hour result, and you're now showing on this chart, 8.64% with 0 kilowatt hours. If that's 8.64% of, of 24 hours, if you distributed that evenly, that would be, 1 hour out of every day on every, every circuit. If you're not using the hourly results in your analysis, I'm not sure. It doesn't seem like it makes any difference. And this gets to Sky's question earlier, how this has any impact on the results or usefulness of it. It's good to see, from a methodological standpoint that, you're considering it and what the distribution of, of hours are. But this doesn't seem like it has any impact in terms of the results for the sort of hosting capacity of more load, unless you're actually matching these hourly load capacities against an hourly generation profile, because a flat or constant uniform load profile is going to be matched up against whatever hour has a 0 capacity on there and show a null result for that hour.
Yeah, I feel like we're still getting sort of a little bit of mixed up between ICA methodology and this data presentation methodology.
Right, I'm just saying if
Yeah.
this isn't used in the ICA methodology, then it's interesting, but it doesn't actually make any difference in the results. I think that's the point that Sky was getting to as well, is how is the hourly methodology going to be used in ICA results? Or if it isn't, then it's just good to be clear that it's not, and this is information, but not it has no impact on the results.
So I will say that I disagree with that characterization, right? So the current ICA does use a nodal hour level analysis result, right? If you go to, for example, SDG&E's ICA portal, you click on a location that you're interested to interconnect a project. There's the option for you to download the 576 load profiles, right? So when you download it, it actually shows you exact profile, which is down to each individual hour of the 576 data points. So that's consistent with what we're talking about here. So I wouldn't say that it's not matching what we're demonstrating. We're presenting the ICA data in the data portal. It's really actually consistent with that.
Right, and that would then be used in an interconnection application in which an hourly load profile was considered rather than a uniform load profile. Is that correct? For an actual application rather than the ICA results.
So again, speaking for SDG&E here, right? The load ICA the goal is to provide a developer, when they look at the profile, they understand what the capacity looks like down to each individual hour. And when we're doing the engineering review, our engineer is not really using load ICA. They're actually doing a detailed engineering study, considering, the load curves of a typical load, depending on what type of load the customer decides to apply for, right? So it's two separate process. We're not looking at load ICA to say that, hey, there's 0 capacity, so we wouldn't interconnect this project. We're actually doing a detailed engineering study, which is not equivalent to load ICA and is not really meant to be replaced by load ICA.
Thank you. I think that's the key point here, is that the actual application would look at a load profile rather than a uniform load that it's used in the ICA results. Thanks for that clarification.
I want to move forward to the next presentation, but there was one question that was very specific to SDG&E. And I thought we'd just grab that one. It was from Mark Hutton, the PAO. Could you explain why the refinements timeline goes through 2025? Why is that amount of time needed? Is it data collection? So I'll just put this slide back up, and you can discuss that from SDG&E's perspective.
Sure. Thanks, Harry. The timeline is really developed based on the amount of work that needs to happen. So as I described earlier, the level of work really happens on kind of multiple latitude. We have to change the downstream model that feeds into load ICA. We also have to change how load ICA construct and use the model to come up with the analysis. And lastly, we have to change how the load ICA publish the data on top of GIS, right? Because we have to match the segment to make sure the data is properly represented in our data portal so customer can use it. So all these changes requires us working with our internal IT groups and also engaging with our vendors who creates, the low ICA and also the core ICA engine, which is, as I mentioned, like our planning tool, which is Synergy, that also needs to change, right? So this timeline reflects the efforts to scope out those changes, work with all the stakeholders to prioritize the work and get it implemented. And as you can see here, we also incorporated testing efforts and development efforts and deployment efforts in order to make sure it's accurately developed. So that's sort of why it pushes into 2025.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and call on Saeed Jazibi, who's the Grid Innovation Engineer for Pacific Gas and Electric, and he will be sharing the annual report for PG&E, so similar to SDG&E's report. You're going to see some of the same questions, and then you're going to see PG&E's responses from their report. So Saeed, are you ready to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you, Ari. So we have basically 3 sections on our report. We will go through our ICA annual report. We would like to introduce a new use case for load ICA. Then we'll have a interim plan for our data portals to better help the customers in the interim. So I can go through the next slide. Thank you, Ari. So PG&E has filed its annual report on December 2022. As you mentioned, one of the requirements was to report on the progress and specifically challenges that the IUUs face while we start actually refining our load ICA. So here we highlight the key challenges for PG&E team. The ICA refinements basically are very dependent on the readiness and availability of other in-flight tools, databases, and processes for PG&E. So for example, we need to use a chronological mode in SIME platform, which will enable actually PG&E to implement the refinements. That is only available in SIME 9.0 and higher versions. So last year we were able basically to upgrade our platform to use SIME 9.2. We completed this in December. We needed to write a accurate test plan and started executing on the test plan, make sure that our results are do match on our servers as well as our local machines and between different versions of SIME. And if there was any differences, we could identify those differences and address them at the source. So we did that. We completed our SIME upgrade. We are also looking to go to the next version of SIME 9.3 Q2 2023. This is critical for the next step because our some of the features needed for our new ICA platform is also dependent on on our long-term planning tool within PG&E, and that should be basically implemented on top of SIME 9.3 version. At the same time, we're looking to have a new version of our load forecasting tool, LoadSeer, that will enable us to actually request load information for each line section and each premise within SIME. And then there needs to be some databases developed for the ICA refinements. Basically, that needs some changes in the process. So we need to have some databases for the new load projects and things like that that are approved. And then there are a couple of IT and publication process adjustments. For example, as described, the new ICA is looking forward. So it looks at the system configuration as it's designed, but what we show on the maps are like historical, like the system as it is. So moving forward, if we're gonna calculate the ICA results for the system as designed, we should actually map them to the system as is, because like some of the equipment, transformers, line sections might not be physically present at the moment. So that is the main challenge we should address at the moment. The other basically challenge and the focus was project scoping, budgeting, and vendor engagement. We started last year. We're still continuing. I will talk about it in the next slides. PG&E has focused its efforts on data validation activities primarily at this point, as we believe this is a key to success for an automated cloud-based platform. This will also help other internal processes within PG&E. Key activities that are listed here happened actually after we filed our first ICA annual report on February 28, 2022. So now we import our queued generation database on a daily basis and our SIME models on a weekly basis instead of a monthly cadence. That we believe that this will help PG&E to keep up the results up to date. The temperature control capacitor banks are now modeled based on historical temperature data of the corresponding distribution planning area. Also, a new process has been developed to automatically assign ICA models with issues to responsible engineers of the same planning area. So once a modeling problem is detected, the responsible engineers is notified with an email to address the modeling issues and rerun the ICA calculations. We ran a system-wide statistical analysis on PG&E final ICA results, so I didn't find any issues that may affect overall the ICA results. We have some future improvements in the near term, which are not outlined in the ruling, but PG&E is taking initiatives to start this. PG&E started actually a project with its vendor SIME last year to improve the power flow engine and improve its convergence for some edge cases. So that project was very successful, and the changes will be deployed in the next version of the SIME upgrade, which is Q2 2023, as I discussed before. And PG&E is planning to post an indication of screen error results on its ICA map, which help DER developers that are going through Rule 21 interconnection process. This is also scheduled for Q2 2023. In regards to CEC coordination efforts, we provided some comments on staff workshop on medium and heavy duty and ride-hailing electric vehicle infrastructure analysis. Also on December 1st, 2022, we had a meeting with CEC staff to discuss and provide inputs on the CEC Edge tool with regards to load ICA data. We obviously look forward for further collaboration given the significant potential to leverage load ICA to support the objectives of the Edge tool. Next slide, please. So this graph is a statistical representation of PG&E system-wide load ICA results. Basically, as Yi mentioned, is a breakdown of ICA result in a different bucket as discussed by Yi. So it's a report basically. It's not an input to our ICA results. It's a system-wide report from our final ICA results. I should also mention that this graph is directly taken from our annual report, so it shows the results for our November 2022 publication cycle. The results shown in our slide has used the most limiting hour methodology, so it's the most conservative approach. So as I mentioned, we are focusing our resources on data quality efforts. After the first rollout of our ICA results in 2018, we started actually refining our processes to better detect data quality problems at the beginning of ICA calculation. I mean, the pre-processing step that we mentioned in previous slides. So we mainly focus on the pre-processing step before running the entire ICA calculations. We had a system-wide network refresh early 2020 where the result had improved significantly and shown on the graph. So as you see, after our system-wide network refresh 2020, we had significant improvements, and so there is a caveat here. I just want to mention that we do not necessarily think that if the number of zeros are high or low, it's a measure of accuracy or quality of the ICA results. Because I mean, a zero ICA may be valid, maybe a valid zero ICA, or it may not be a valid zero ICA result. So I think these reports are helpful, but doesn't necessarily indicate the accuracy of ICA results. Meaning that in reality, in PG&E territory, we have line sections with zero available capacity, which are valid. However, as the evolution of PG&E ICA statistical distribution over time is steady, we think that this shows the robustness of our ICA process. So with that, we can basically move to next slide where we talk about the current use case of load ICA and the proposed future use case. Thank you, Ari. So load ICA's current use is to provide a directional information for siting new load. PG&E believes that load ICA is a valuable resource to start the load interconnection journey. However, in its current form, it misses some critical information. For example, forecast of load groups. So we believe that load ICA can be used to improve internal processes in the earlier stage of load interconnection process where the customer will benefit at the end of the day. And we believe that this will derive significant improvement in customer experience. So with that in mind, PG&E is trying to expedite the implementation of the load ICA, and we can move to the next slide. So so we had drafted a comprehensive project requirements and shared with that requirements with our vendors last year. We also kicked off the design section with our vendors, and the vendor selection and contracting step is in process. So with that, PG&E is discussing with this vendor and investigating the possibility to fast track and expedite the project to Q4 2024, basically 1 year ahead of schedule. And that is basically possible because of the status of our in-flight softwares. So we thought that the long-term planning tools, SIM upgrades, and things like that were scheduled to be delivered in following year, but those are kind of expedited. We started actually to collaborate with the same vendor. We looking at the ways to actually fast track and make sure that we can expedite the delivery of the final product to Q4 2024. We believe that this will help us to use the data to improve the customer experience through the earliest stage of PG&E interconnection process. Next slide, please. So the plan is to explore the possibility of using load ICA data by our service planning and distribution planning engineers in the new business interconnection process. I should note that this will only be feasible after load ICA refinements are complete, so after Q4 2024. The goal is to streamline the early stage of interconnection process by using the load ICA data to assess EV and new business loads. We believe that this has some mutual benefits for our customers as well as PG&E. I want to emphasize here that we are looking to use ICA to improve the load interconnection process for our customers. We are not specifically targeting DER developers. Instead, we are focusing on improving the process for all customers, which may or may not be DER developers. As you know, PG&E has a large territory, so we had more than 600 EV load application last year, and we anticipate to have more than 1,000 this year. It's just for EV loads. And with that, the initial application review needs to become more efficient to keep up with the increase of number of applications. So we have limited human resources, and this will help with the process efficiency. We'll have more timely response in early stage of interconnection process. This will streamline the process, and it will reduce wasted resources. So I mentioned before, but just want to reiterate that last year, of the 600 EV load application, 1/3 of those withdrawn before moving forward into utility design phase. Also, from there, half of those applications did not move to the construction phase due to real estate competition or supply chain issues. So we run the initial review, but the applications do not move forward. This is a kind of waste of resources that we can limit if we streamline our processes. Although we believe that this is a very useful data that will improve our customer experience in early stage of interconnection process, I should also mention that the load ICA data published on the map is still the directional use and is not a replacement of the load interconnection process. This is mainly because we're not able to fully automate the interconnection process, nor the engineering review. We need to have an interaction basically between customers and our service planning team to validate their application data. This will also avoid two customers requesting for the same capacity simultaneously. So for example, during the application intake, PG&E helps the customer to calculate demand numbers. So sometimes they come up with some load data that when PG&E engineers look at it, it's either overestimated or underestimated. So there needs to be a communication between PG&E and customers to make sure that they size their loads correctly. And not all customers have consultants or expertise in-house to do and run those analyses. The other case is that we're not considering secondary voltage drop on our calculations. The other caveat is that it's true that we basically refresh ICA result as frequent as we can, but sometimes they're a month old. So there needs to be a check by an engineer basically in the interim. So we think we could expedite this process, but like load ICA in isolation will not replace the interconnection process. The other point to make is that, as discussed, this data will be available to use after load ICA refinements are implemented, meaning if PG&E is successful to expedite it after Q4 2020, it's going to be after Q4 2024. However, we recognize that there is a serious need for a better guidance to our customers using the available tools in hand. So we're proposing an interim solution in the next section to supplement our ICA maps with additional data to help the electrification transition. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, PG&E is investigating the possibility to fast track and expedite the load ICA improvement to Q4 2024. But in the interim, we would like to improve our directional data for siting new load on the map, as well as better inform customers of how to use the combined data. So we are planning to provide a high-level directional information using ICA data, forecast data, and project data at each location to improve guidance to customers that are looking to site their new load. Basically, this will provide more accurate directional guidance that benefits our interconnection customers. So the proposal is to add some additional data on the line section specific pop-up on our ICA map that indicates the likeliness of having capacity on the corresponding line section. We basically estimate that it will take us around 3 months to implement this approach. And I should mention that all interconnection applications are still subject to engineering review. So this method does not guarantee any available capacity, but will for sure help customers to better site their project. With that, we can move to the next slide. So on the left side, we can see a mock-up of this interim solution for our ICA maps. For the people that have used our ICA map before, we'll be adding a new tab to the pop-up box of each line section. This tab will potentially show 3 answers. There is likely no available capacity at this location. This means that interconnecting new load will likely require grid upgrades, and it means longer interconnection timeline. The other scenario is there is a likely available capacity at this location. However, every interconnection application is subject to an engineering review. And and the next scenario is an engineering review is necessary because, for example, we had a planned project or planned load or planned capacity project. So it needs more investigation with our engineers. So we will look at four different actually data fields. So we look at forecast feeder capacity, forecast bank capacity, load application, planned project, and load ICA data. And so we'll have the data available in the back end and a logic developed to reach to one of these answers. And the final results basically will be published on the map. For example, if we look at the third example at the bottom of the page, there is forecast feeder capacity here. There is forecast bank capacity. And there is no load application on this feeder. And there are planned projects on this feeder, and there is some available capacity shown on ICA map for this specific line section. So the results will be likely to have available capacity for this specific situation. So that is the interim plan for our ICA maps. We can open it up for QA. Thank you, Ari.
Yeah, thank you, Saeed. We did get two questions I see in the chat directed at PG&E, and I want to take those two and then move on to SCE, if that's okay with you, Taru.
Yeah, that would be fine. We just have a hard stop at 11:55, so just if everyone can be mindful of that.
All right, I'll go ahead and read out those questions. Okay, PG, can you share further how PG&E reduces wasted resources or decreases the attrition rate on the application? So that language was right from this slide, Saeed. So they want to know about the reducing wasted resources. How is PG&E doing that?
Thank you, Ari. And I would like to add that this is from Roger Lynn from the Center for Biological Diversity.
Yeah, so we'll use ICA information in the early stages of load interconnection process for assessment. And that is a very helpful piece of information for our engineers, so that we're thinking for some small loads or medium sized loads, they can take a look at this data instead of running SIME analysis. So this will I wouldn't say replace, but it's a piece of information they can take a look, and if they see necessary, they run their application, they run their SIME analysis. If they see fit, they can use this information and move forward with approving or disapproving the project. So it's more of process efficiency and better use of our engineers' time reviewing those applications.
Great. And then we had a question from Sky Stanfield representing IREC. Saeed, based on your proposal to integrate the ICA into the internal processes, does this suggest that you expect the ICA results to be relatively close to the study results for the conditions the ICA evaluates? I understand the caveat that the study still needs to be completed for some elements.
Yeah, so with the refinements, we expect that the results are close enough, but as mentioned, we have some caveats that we talked about, right? First of all, these results might be 1 month old. The other thing is that this is not the only information that engineers using. They use they basically they start communicating with our customers, and they start to actually realizing and know what their needs are, what are the size of their application, because as I mentioned, sometimes they're oversized or undersized their load interconnection application. So we think that the new refinements will better align those studies, but ICA in isolation will not be will not represent interconnection process. This is going to be a part of the interconnection process. One piece of information our engineers would use to streamline our interconnection process.
All right, and we did get another question from Tam Hunt at GPI. And we're having a few more questions come in, but we'll probably need to hold those until a little bit later. But this question, Saeed, was about your interim proposal, and I'll go ahead and switch to that. Tam asks, in terms of actionability, every scenario mentioned requires an interconnection application to gain any actionable information. So how is this interim solution providing any value to applicants?
As mentioned, this is to help customer better start their interconnection journey. So it's a better guidance for citing their loads. But even after ICA refinements, after Q4 2024, or for other IUs, we believe that ICA will still be directional because we don't see a way to automate all steps of interconnection process. There needs to be a communication between our service planning team, capacity planning team, and our customers. We cannot eliminate those steps. But we're trying to basically to lay the grounds for in better using and utilizing the available data, which is we think very helpful. It could be very helpful, but it cannot replace the interconnection process.
All right, thank you, Saeed. And I know there are a few questions here that weren't answered yet. I do want to call on my colleague, Selena Sanchez from Southern California Edison. She is the Integration and Capacity Analysis Manager. She's going to be presenting a report, and just acknowledging the time constraints, we'll go pretty quickly through this. And there are a few questions about, again, expediting, accelerating the schedule. And we do have a slide about that. And Selena may be able to comment on that. So Selena, I'll call on you to present SCE's report.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, soon to be good afternoon. My name is Selena Sanchez. I am the IC Engineering Manager for Southern California Edison, and I'm here to present what is our plan for the near term for our interconnection portals, as well as provide an outlook to our long-term vision for Load ICA, and then go over our SCE's annual reports findings. You go to the next slide, please. So in the interim, the first immediate update that we could provide is updates to our Dr. PEP portal. In this portal, we're actually instantiating a brand new layer called the Power Service Availability Layer, also known as PSA. And this layer is going to have two components to it. It'll provide some aspects at the substation level, and then break it down at the feeder head level. And what we're planning to do is, utilizing the GNA information, we will subtract high confidence load growth projects and then provide the corresponding amounts to be able to help our load interconnection customers at this point in time be able to provide further information in terms of how much reserve load capacity do we have at the circuit level and then at the substation. We're also looking at consolidating and performing some enhancements to our load growth project data, combining those and streamlining those processes. And as we are also very interested in partnering with our customers and providing more outreach and education in terms of what Load ICA does provide today, where we're at, where we're going, and then how to use the information. Next slide, please. So the long-term vision outside of the immediate enhancements that I just went over, we're also looking at implementing our 5 pillars of the Load ICA as mandated by the ALJ ruling. And beyond 2027, we are looking at how to leverage this into our system planning decision-making process, right? So first of all, we want to make sure that we're adhering to the mandates we're working on, and you'll see what we're working on in the next couple of slides. We are looking for the future of integrating this into our system planning process. You could go to the next slide. Okay, so in this slide, it's a little bit busy. What we tried to do is of the 7 items that we were covering in our annual report, we put 3 of those items consolidated here. So what you see on the slide is for each of the 5 pillars of the Load ICA refinements, where you could see how we're implementing it, what our proposed challenges are, and the potential solutions. So for the first line item, we're looking at instantiating to enable the functionality of these 5 Load ICA refinements. SE is looking at making foundational and business process changes to support the distribution planning process and, the integration of Load ICA. With the integration of these systems, we'll provide, and support. We'll have the support to be adapted. So some of the challenges for the first one is, as we're looking to integrate both the models and the connectivity models and the profiles associated with the load growth and distribution projects for the first year of the planning horizon, we first must consolidate all of our load growth projects into one ultimate solution, one repository. Right now, it's different processes. We have different tariffs that govern load interconnection process. So first order of business is to homogenize that. And then we're also working on developing our business process to help streamline and alleviate some of the bottlenecks and improve efficiencies through the load interconnection process. We're also ensuring that for year 1 of the planning horizon, it should coincide with our grid needs assessments that's published on an annual basis. It is our intent to include all high confidence load growth projects that are greater than 250 kW. And we're planning to reimagine what Load ICA looks like today, right? So in the future, with each of these pillars, we want to provide as much transparency as possible, being able to have different cadences for some of these, layers of information. So for example, for this first line item will be, we plan to update this on a monthly cadence. For line item 2, which is the distribution upgrades required to support these, these forecasted load growth projects, the primary challenge is, how we're going to include them on system, right? Right now, when our distribution system planners or engineers work on projects, right, some of their plans may change as they go into final engineering and execution. So what we plan may look very different than what comes out. And so to help improve that situation, we're looking to enhance our grid connectivity model to build upon the current as-is system topology and also include planned system upgrades. Next slide, please. In efforts to include the forecasted DER growth, what we're planning to do is really separate the study assumptions between Gen ICA and Load ICA. So for Load ICA, we want to align with our distribution system planning process, which aligns with using IPER DER forecasts. Whereas for the Gen ICA, we use the well-established generation interconnection queue. And in efforts to be able to completely distinguish that, we need to refine the methodology for integrating the DER forecasting into the Load ICA calculations and separate from the Gen ICA interconnection, Gen ICA calculations, excuse me. We could go to the next slide. So for these two, similarly to the distribution system upgrades, which is pillar number 2, we plan on including any planned network reconfigurations. What we're envisioning is to ensure that we're including or have the ability and flexibility to adopt and reflect what's going on in our system with permanent transfers, right? We want to provide a better methodology for including these in our monthly updates to the circuit topology. And the way we're envisioning this is that you'll have an as-is topology and a to-be topology so that you could see the differences between what exists today and what will be. And this specific line item will also be included in the annual layer. And in efforts to develop this, we're developing cutting edge technology in order to validate transfers as they occur. So like with any system planning process, there's some things that come to fruition and some things that don't, as well as the volatility of, weather conditions or things that happen out in the field where we do have to provide unplanned transfers that may become permanent. And so we're also taking those into consideration in terms of our solutioning. And for the last pillar, the distribution system is very, very dynamic in nature. And we want to include proper forecasting within our profiles. So as such, circuits may look very different at the end of the year as they were initially proposed due to the dynamic changes in the distribution system process. And this may affect the way, system upgrades are, it may push system upgrades forwards or backwards depending on the needs and the dynamic changes in the distribution. So what we're looking to do is enhance our profile creation to include the as planned high confidence load growth projects, as well as to include the forecasts for our loads. Okay. So for our outlook for our ultimate solution in terms of the Load ICA refinements, we are looking at our projection was Q3 of 2026. We're doing a phased approach in efforts to, excuse me. So we're doing a phased approach and we're currently in the initiate and plan phase. We're on target towards our 2026 go live date. We have cross-functional teams that are working on the business requirements, working with our IT business partners and developers to be able to move forward with the design. We are looking at building the foundational capabilities for as planned meter to grid, enhancing our grid connectivity model, and also enhancing the way we include the forecasts for DERs. And this will be integrated with our load flow analysis. We're looking to also include and expand additional functional capabilities in our load flow engine, as well as performance, being able to optimize and integrate with systems of records and systems of truth. So we could go to the next one. Thank you very much. So just like my colleagues from PG&E and SDG&E mentioned, we do, according to the well-established methodologies, we have our statistical representation of what our uniform load results are. And Saeed had mentioned that their increments are done at a 10 kW cadence. For us, we do our increments at 100 kW increments. And so this is a representation of where we're at. One item I would like to mention is that from a node hour methodology and the most limiting hour methodology, the most limiting hour methodology is more of a subset of the node hour methodology. So it's just different ways to look at it.
You know, Selena, I think we can skip the slide in coordination with the CEC because we're actually doing that along with the other IUs. So why don't I just go to the next slide?
Okay. So to conclude Essie's portion, we are looking to really expand the current capabilities of ICA. Currently, our ICA is built with historical data in nature. I'd like to, I see a lot of the questions that are coming on the chat as well as throughout, the beginning of this presentation. And I do hear a lot of frustration regarding where we're at and where we're going. I think it's important to mention the fact that there's a difference between the level of maturity for a generation ICA's use case versus the load ICA use case, right? And with these load ICA refinements, we are looking, we're really hopeful that it will be a beneficial tool for all parties involved, in internal and external. And we're looking to help streamline a lot of the interconnection processes. We believe that with, partnership with all stakeholders involved, we could definitely look to make our ICA tool orders of magnitude better and be able to correspond on a more, collaborative nature.
Great. I'm going to call back Saeed Jazibi at PG&E and Ely from San Diego Gas and Electric. And Taru, I know that we are running out of time. I'm going to leave it to you to decide how we address the questions that are for all the IUs at this point.
So I think we can take perhaps one or two questions if they're brief, but then we do need to go on break and we will probably restart at 12:30. The questions that have not been answered that are in the chat unanswered will be answered later in the afternoon in the Q&A session.
Right. I do believe there was a question from Gabe Petlin early on that he said could be answered by all of the IUs. Do you recall that one? I'm looking for it.
Yeah, thanks, Ari. This is Gabe Petlin, Energy Division. So yeah, the question I wanted to ask to all three, now that you've all given your presentations, is how does your load ICA take into account flexible load opportunities? It seems like if you are telling a would-be charging station operator there is limited or no hosting capacity based on, the assumed worst hour, that would sort of ignore the opportunity for flexible load that could enhance the hosting capacity simply through charging load modification. So how is that being considered in your methodology, given how big an issue that is right now for the state? I guess this would go one by one to each utility, maybe starting with PG&E.
Yes, thank you, Gabe. Great question. So as we presented, right now we're looking for a more general use case for all customers. As mentioned in the interim steps of beginning of interconnection process to assess load applications. But we do see potential for this use case that you mentioned. But we think this is this needs basically this requires some process changes as well as technology development that needs to be there. So, and also we think this use case can be a use case for a 5-year plus from now. We think we should start with a more broader use case and kind of validate how useful this ICA data is for our internal processes. And then the next version or next generation of use cases will likely be like flexible load interconnection or other use cases.
So if you're going to keep to the time, I don't want to extend that, but I think when we assemble the stakeholder panel in the afternoon, this would probably be a good question to ask them about, because it would be great to hear from stakeholders how important this is to them. Like, they may say, hey, we actually just want to be able to charge 24/7. We don't want to have to think about it. Or they might say, yeah, that would work if I just knew the hours to, reduce a little bit, and that meant the difference between a long, expensive interconnection and a fast, inexpensive interconnection. That would be a good business decision. I'd love to hear their perspective on that, if that's an important issue to the industry. So maybe we can incorporate that into the stakeholder discussion later this afternoon. And then if it is of interest, we can hear more from utilities on how that could possibly be implemented, the feasibility of that.
Thank you, Gabe. I think Saeed probably summed up the response for all the IOUs, but we can continue discussing that in the afternoon session. So thank you. Very good question. Taru, if it's okay, maybe we'll take one question. And Selena, if you're still on, there was a question from Mark Hutton, Cal Advocates. There was a concern about, and this kind of applied to everyone, but he asked it during PG&E, but also, for SE, what are the reasons that we might or might not be able to expedite our schedule? And frankly speaking, for SE, I'll say that our schedule goes out the longest of the 3 IOUs. So I don't know if Selena wants to talk more about that before we break. I'll just put our schedule out, which is right here. Selena, are you able to discuss, why this goes out to 2026?
Sure. It'd be my pleasure. Hi, good afternoon. So to answer that question, we're currently going through a system-wide refresh. Full transparency, we just completed a root cause analysis last year that looked into some of our, ICA study results. And we did find some issues with our study results that resulted in inadvertent double counting of DERs. And so we are currently working on swiftly addressing that. We found the root cause, we found a fix for it, and we're currently in the deployment phase of that system-wide refresh. So as soon as we're done with that, we're looking at also, implementing our LGP and others. And so from a load ICA perspective, we're reimagining a lot of where we're currently at from an SE perspective, right? We want to be able to provide our customers with the latest and greatest information in terms of incorporating our forecasts as as well as incorporating the system topology and all of those changes. There's a lot of infrastructure that has to be built and designed that currently does not exist today. And so, as a reminder, ICA was kind of envisioned and is, slightly different kind of planning tool, if you will. Well, I can't say planning tool because that's where we want to go, but it's a different tool separate from our system planning process. And what we want to do is take those synergies and take that information and work towards a convergence of the two. And in that takes some time and efforts to be able to homogenize these into a more convergent model. And so with that, we're doing a phased approach to be able to attain those benefits and those efficiencies with our 2026 go live.
Thank you, Selena. And I want to thank Ryan, Saeed, and Selena for their presentations. I know there are a lot of questions here, and there's going to be a full hour of Q&A after the panel in the afternoon. So I know that Edie's been tracking these questions. The IUs will be back then, and I'll be able to answer some of these questions for you. So I'm going to hand it over to Taru.
Thank you, Ari, and thank you to all the presenters and for everyone in engaging and asking questions. We're ending a little bit later than planned, so I'm proposing we take a lunch break and we come back at 12:35.